Excellencies, colleagues and friends, a very warm welcome to IPI. It's wonderful to see so many familiar faces, new faces at this very timely event. And a special warm welcome to my friend Selwin Hart, the Special Advisor to the UN Secretary General on climate change and the just transition. As many of you know, Selwin was formerly the executive director of the Inter-American Development Bank, and prior to that was ambassador of Barbados to the United States, and is absolutely steeped in climate-related issues, the climate agenda. So we are absolutely delighted to be welcoming him and hosting him here at this event. Selwin, we have 55 days left for the Climate Ambition Summit, and the time seems to be right to galvanize action to jolt the member states on the climate change. We're delighted to see you at the helm of the Climate Summit, and we know we are in good hands. This morning, we heard the Secretary General say that humanity is in the hot seat in two literal senses. We are therefore eager to hear from you the details of the Secretary General's Climate Ambition Summit and how all of us can collectively help you make this summit a success. This is our goal for this discussion. The scenario previously described by the latest IPCC report, the Assessment Report 6, warns we need to steer the path with bold action and transform our way of living. And the clock is ticking. The good news is we know what must be done. In the simplest terms, we need to end fossil fuel use and invest massively in renewables, ensuring a just transition. While we need greater political resolve to address climate change, developing countries are also facing financial and regulatory constraints, compounding their lack of fiscal space, debt burdens, and the absence of financing. In this context, we're proud to say that IPI is supporting the initiative laid out by Prime Minister Mia Mottley of Barbados. The Bridgetown Agenda is addressing some of the principal economic challenges with possible fixes that would help boost climate action. In tandem, those people in the most vulnerable situations need those tools, need the tools and resources to adapt and face losses and damages. Their countries should not feel alone, and the international community must respond. So far, we've had the hottest day on record and the hottest week on record. For the first time in known history, average global temperature has climbed above 17 degrees Celsius. That's nearly 63 degrees Fahrenheit. And at least 32 countries have experienced extreme weather events since the start of the year. As the SG said in his speech this morning, the era of global warming has ended and the era of global boiling has arrived. All these new weather patterns prompted by the El Nino effect come at the cost of immense human suffering, heightened vulnerability, exacerbating the poverty that already exists in too many parts of the world. Yet we must remain optimistic with the human and capital cost experienced already by the hottest summer in recorded human history, and with a warming above 1.1 degrees centigrade to 1.2 degrees centigrade. Are these climate realities enough now for global leaders to increase their political commitment and raise ambition to the levels actually needed? In other words, can the Climate Ambition Summit be the turning point? With these words, let me turn to you, Selwin, and invite you to lay out for us the Secretary General's vision and how he's taking it forward. We will then engage in a discussion and then open the floor to all of you here in our hall at IPI and the online audience. So over to you.
Thank you so much, and good afternoon. And again, thank you so much, Zeid. And I also want to thank you, Yemena and all of the colleagues here from IPI for helping us to spread the word and to spread the message on the urgency of taking action to address the climate crisis. And the Climate Ambition Summit, COP28, they're all taking place within a very special context. The reality is when one looks at all indicators on climate, all indicators on climate are heading in the wrong direction. Global emissions are at their highest levels ever in recorded human history, and they continue to rise. At the same time, we're seeing massive and catastrophic impacts on every continent, in every region, and in every country. What is discomfort for us here in New York City, or for some of us in New York City, is resulting in severe death and destruction. So this is a moment where leaders must absolutely lead. So despite this gloomy outlook of rising emissions, increasingly more severe impacts, science is telling us that we still have an opportunity to prevent the worst impacts of the climate crisis. Human activity has caused this problem, and human ingenuity and human creativity can get us out of it. But the reality is we have a narrow window to act. We cannot delay taking action to 2030 or 2040 or 2050. The decisions that leaders from governments, private sector, financial institutions, civil society, the decisions that they take now, the choices that they make now will determine whether we are able to prevent the worst impacts of the climate crisis. We've simply run out of time. The decisions taken within this decade, now and within this decade, will make or break our efforts to have a livable, sustainable, prosperous, and secure future. So moments like the Climate Ambition Summit are absolutely critical. Any political moment, and the SG was very clear this morning on what that roadmap in 2023 looks like. We have the Africa Climate Summit, we have the G20 Summit, we have his Climate Ambition Summit, and we have COP28. The decisions that leaders take now and the decisions they make are consequential for human survival. So it's absolutely essential that we use every gathering of leaders to press them to do more, to press them to work with each other, to cooperate, and to address this crisis and deliver a response that's commensurate with the nature of the threat that we absolutely face. And the menu is absolutely clear. We need to rapidly reduce emissions this decade, which means progressively and orderly and in a managed way phasing out fossil fuels. We need to massively scale up renewable energy all over the world, not in selected geographies. We need to massively invest in the clean solutions across every high emitting sector: energy, transport, steel, cement, agriculture. Ensure that we decarbonize every single high emitting sector at the pace and scale that we also absolutely need. And simultaneously, we also need to ensure that we're scaling up investments in adaptation and resilience building. The impacts are happening. We can see it in our daily lives. And the unfortunate paradox of this climate crisis is that those that have contributed least are being hit hardest by the climate crisis. For example, over the course of the last 50 years, close to 70% of all climate-related deaths occurred in the least developed countries. These countries that have contributed a fraction of a percentage to global warming. So issues of climate justice should not be seen as charity or secondary to our response to the climate crisis. Climate justice and delivering climate justice must be seen as central to solving and addressing the climate crisis. And as you said, Zeid, in your opening, finance, we need to rapidly transform global finance and the global financial architecture. Right now, those fossil fuel companies are making enormous and quite frankly obscene profits. 4 trillion last year. What is even more alarming is that the stock market is rewarding fossil fuel companies who are reneging on their climate commitments. So you wreck the planet, and the financial system rewards you. This is, this shows a financial system that's totally out of whack with human survival and what needs to be done to save the planet and people. And we also need the multilateral development banks and the international financial institutions who hold a privileged position at the intersection of public and private finance. We need these institutions to do more to support developing countries to accelerate the transition away from fossil fuels and to invest more in adaptation. So there is a need to ensure that the financial system really is fit for purpose in addressing this massive crisis. And finally, we need to significantly strengthen international cooperation and collaboration. No one country, no matter how big and powerful you are, will be able to solve this climate crisis alone. And you will not be able to build enough seawalls to protect any one nation or your people. So it's absolutely essential that countries put aside their differences. We'll never agree on anything. You know, I'm a Liverpool fan. Archie from the UK is a Manchester United fan, and we will never, Arsenal, sorry, and we will never, we will never agree on football. But I think that we share the same views on what needs to be done to solve the climate crisis. So countries need to cooperate and work together. And quite frankly, this is the backdrop to the Climate Ambition Summit. I know you have a few questions, but this is the context that this summit is placed in. And this is why we have identified the political deliverables that we have for the SG's Climate Ambition Summit. Sorry.
Thank you, Selwin, for that. And I should have said right at the beginning, the reason for my James Mason type voice is that I lost it yesterday. So I'm hoping that it won't desert me today. When you spoke of the financial markets and how detached they sometimes can be from realities, I at one stage remarked that I wondered if the day before our final day on this planet, the headline would not be something like, you know, markets at an all-time high, stock prices all-time high, financial speculators are delighted by the news, and the next day would be our last. But let's bore a little bit into greater detail. Thank you for the introduction, Selwin. If we can bore into greater detail in terms of what the SG aspires for the Climate Ambition Summit. And there seem to be 3 critical pillars: ambition, credibility, and implementation. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about what you expect in these 3 key areas. And you alluded to some of this in your opening remarks, but perhaps if you could provide us with some more detail.
Thanks. In addition to these 3 pillars, and I'll get to the 3 pillars in a minute, the 2 cross-cutting themes for the Climate Ambition Summit are acceleration and cooperation. As I said before, it's absolutely clear that we need to accelerate our actions and efforts across the board. We need to accelerate action to close the emissions gap, accelerate action to deliver climate justice, to scale up finance, adaptation. So acceleration really needs to be the name of the game. The reality is we are making progress, but it's not fast enough and it's not going far enough. So acceleration must be sort of the cross-cutting theme of the Climate Ambition Summit. And the second, as I said, is cooperation. Right? To deliver on all of these outcomes and goals, it requires unprecedented levels of cooperation and coordination between countries and the private sector, civil society. So acceleration and cooperation underpins the deliveries and the deliverables and the political outcomes that we're seeking under these three pillars. So the first pillar is the ambition pillar, which is primarily directed at governments. We need governments to come to the table with more ambitious national commitments. It's important for governments to set the tone, to set the right policy and regulatory signals. We know, for example, that on the mitigation front, the G20, it represents 80% of global emissions. We need these countries to be more ambitious in terms of what they intend to do now and the signals that they provide to markets and to private sector and to the private sector on what they intend to do in coming decades. So we have developed a number of very specific acts and the Secretary General, he has defined those acts in his acceleration agenda. He has been asking for more ambitious pre-2030 nationally determined contributions. He has been asking developed countries to fast forward their net zero pledges and commitments to move as close as possible to 2040. And he's been asking the emerging economies to move as fast as possible, close as possible to 2050. I think we all need to recognize that all G20 countries are not alike. Some have more capacity, capability, and financial might and power. They need to absolutely work together. Those that have more in terms of finance and technology need to work with those that don't have the financial might and capacity of the richer, developed G20 countries. He's also asking for concrete energy transition plans that provide the clarity on phasing out coal by 2030 in OECD countries and 2040 in the rest of the world. The IPCC, in its 1.5 degree report, has said that the single most important step that can be taken to keep the 1.5 degree goal of the Paris Agreement alive is to phase out coal. Phase out coal by 2030 in OECD countries and 2040 for the rest of the world. It is extremely disappointing that the G7 nations have not been able to clearly state that they will be phasing out coal completely from their energy mix by 2030. They've not. Yet, all of them claim that they are in line with the 1.5 degree goal. If you're an OECD country and you still have coal in the energy mix by 2030, it's not consistent with the 1.5 degree goal of the Paris Agreement. It's absolutely clear. Coal needs to go by 2030 in the OECD countries and 2040. We understand the needs of energy security, and it must be done in a managed, orderly fashion. But if we are to be consistent with the 1.5 degree goal of the Paris Agreement, the world needs to move away from coal. And we also know that we need to progressively move away from oil and gas. The IEA in its net zero scenario has clearly stated that new oil and gas exploration, and this was in the report from the IEA just before COP26 in Glasgow, that new oil and gas expansion and exploration is incompatible with a 1.5 degree or a net zero pathway. Yet we're seeing massive oil and gas licensing in many developed countries who have committed to net zero by 2050. So you're seeing this backtracking and double speak, and if I'm impolite to say, hypocrisy coming from certain parts of the world in terms of what needs to be done in the energy transition. The energy transition for the developing world, especially, must also be a just transition. And it's absolutely critical that the required support is given to the developing world to help them to accelerate their transition. We have a useful model, the Just Energy Transition Partnerships, which we support and we encourage because this really has shown that the energy transition for developing countries who are struggling, as you said at the beginning, with high levels of debt, lack of fiscal space, issues of inequality, issues of high employment, will need to pay attention. We really need to absolutely pay attention to the social component of the transition in these large emerging economies. Under this ambition track, we're also seeking contributions and pledges to the Green Climate Fund. We're in the second replenishment period for the Green Climate Fund. It's absolutely crucial that this sign of commitment in providing support to the developing world is delivered. So the ambition track, sorry for spending so much time on it, it is really focused on what governments should bring to the table. There's a very strong focus under this pillar on what the G20 need to do, what the G7 and other developed countries need to do, because 80% of the globally 80% of global emissions, 75% of the global economy carries with it some responsibility for leading and taking action. The credibility track is focused on very specific and targeted acts for the private sector, for financial institutions, for cities and regions. Over the course of the last few years, since the Secretary General's 2019 Climate Summit and COP26 in Glasgow, there's been a massive growth in net zero pledges by financial institutions, corporates, cities, and regions. Many of them have pledged to reach net zero by 2050. And these voluntary pledges are welcome, absolutely. But as I said at the beginning, they need to be credible as well, right? So we've been hearing over the years calls from members of civil society, as well as corporates who are doing the right thing for some order to be brought to this landscape. And last year, the Secretary General asked a group of experts under the excellent leadership of Catherine McKenna. It was a very diverse group from developing countries. Half were women, half were men. And they presented a report going into COP27 to the Secretary General with 10 really great recommendations, one of which was a recommendation calling on all entities making these voluntary net zero pledges to present credible transition plans with interim targets, telling us what you're doing in 2025 and 2030, telling us how these targets align with 1.5, telling us that these plans cover your all emissions in your value chain, your direct, your indirect emissions from your suppliers, and telling us how they achieve the goal of a just transition. So our acts for the Climate Ambition Summit is made a voluntary net zero pledge, show us your transition plan. Show us your transition plan. Tell us how you will get there, right? The third pillar is the implementation pillar, which really is very focused on this cooperation narrative or cooperation or cooperative action, right? Again, over the course of the last few years, we've had a plethora of initiatives and partnerships. Initiatives and partnerships all doing, some fantastic work on the decarbonization of high emitting sectors and partnerships delivering various aspects of climate justice. But we've also seen, with the growth of these partnerships, coalitions, and initiatives, lots of fragmentation. And I'll give you one example: early warning systems. Last year, we recognized that virtually every UN system entity had a program or an initiative related to early warning system. Every multilateral development bank had something going on early warning systems. Every bilateral partner, the Americans, the Canadians, the UK, the Japanese, the Swiss, everyone had something on early warning systems. But the reality is that we were not closing the early warning systems gap. Still, 2/3 of SIDS and LDC countries were not covered by an early warning system. 6 out of every 10 Africans were not covered by an effective early warning system. And the Secretary General, he set a global goal. Within the next 5 years, or by 2027, I want every person on Earth to be covered by an early warning system. He did this in March 2023. And he tasked WMO, the World Meteorological Organization, and UNDRR to prepare an action plan to make this happen. That action plan was prepared and delivered at COP27. And we're in the process now of implementing that action plan. We've brought together all of the UN system entities under this action plan, bilateral donors, partners, the private sector, to deliver. 30 countries have been identified, 30 countries that will be the focus of strengthening early warning systems this year, ending fragmentation, promoting cooperation, promoting collaboration to deliver at scale and impact. Similarly, with the Just Energy Transition Partnerships, the G7, under the leadership of Germany and the UK, are coordinating around supporting South Africa, Vietnam, and Indonesia to accelerate their energy transition. So can this model of cooperation, of bringing fragmented initiatives and partnerships together around a single goal, can this be applied to other sectors? And we're seeking to do this at the Climate Ambition Summit. So for example, battery storage. We know that battery storage, or scaling up the deployment of battery storage, is absolutely essential to ensuring that large quantities of renewables can be seamlessly integrated into power grids and the energy systems of countries. We have about 20 plus different battery storage initiatives. 20. We need to scale up from around 20, 25 gigawatts of installed battery storage capacity globally to about 950 gigawatts of installed battery storage capacity by 2030. In 7 years, in less than 7 years. No one country can do this on its own. No one initiative can do this alone. We need a true global platform and coalition to undertake this massive scale now, which is about 170 gigawatts a year between now and 2030. So we've challenged the Clean Energy Ministerial, I was at their meeting in Goa last week, to create this truly global platform that would bring many of the disparate and existing initiatives together around this single goal. We're also trying to do this for shipping, given the great results coming from the IMO, as well as some of the other industrial sectors like steel and cement. What needs to happen now is this ending of fragmentation and bringing existing initiatives and partnerships together to achieve these big goals and results. So we're hoping that on the 20th of September, as the slide on the screen indicates, that we can see a set of first movers and first doers delivering on these three pillars, but with very concrete and specific outcomes. Not everyone will show up, but a few months after, we'll have COP 28, and we hope that more will join this thing. But it is a moment for truly first movers and first doers. And in closing, I'll just give one example. In 2019, about 13 asset owners, primarily insurance companies, came together to form the Asset Owners Alliance, Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance, in 2019 at the Secretary General's Climate Summit. About 13 to 15. That group, the Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance, has now grown to 80 plus members, all committed to achieve net zero by 2050. They're working on their transition plans. They have set interim targets, etc. Right? But that group of first movers has grown multiple times. So the expectation is not everyone will not be ready, but we definitely need first movers and first doers on the Secretary General's acceleration agenda. Sorry.
Thank you, Selwin, for outlining, I think, the most critical issue. And I perhaps would want to press on it at this point a little bit longer, because I think what you're saying to us is that the SG is trying to solve a problem which has long dogged the UN and is doing so really very intelligently. So both of us have served as ambassadors for our own countries, and both of us have served, I used to, of course, and you still are, serve the UN at the highest levels. We know that there is this issue of a gap that exists between declaration and an actual commitment nationally, and how to close the gap is normally done in the human rights perspective context. What you do is you start to audit each country and say, well, these are the recommendations that you've accepted in the Universal Periodic Review. Now we're going to assess actually what you've been doing and then come up with a report. What you're suggesting, and I think this is really quite novel, is that you're creating an environment, both in terms of credibility and acceleration, and you're using the circumstance to squeeze not just countries, but other entities into a cooperative environment, which will then produce a result. I think the question I have for you is, what does this look like at a national level? You touched upon it when it comes to battery storage as a collaborative endeavor, but what does it mean at a national level? And of course, we'll have the global stock take coming up as well.
So what does this look like at a national level? And you're right, it's great, countries make these these statements internationally, and then they go back home and face a difficult task of having to implement them. And of course, this is something that we actually need to see implementation on the ground. We need to see in all of these countries accelerated deployment of renewable energy. We need to see in all of these countries accelerated phasing out of fossil fuels. We need to see accelerated implementation of adaptation actions, and we need to see accelerated strengthening of early warning systems, and we need to see the finance flowing to all of these activities. And in some respect, we are seeing that, right? We're seeing, unfortunately, primarily in China, US, and the EU, the accelerated deployment of renewables. Renewables, or the growth in renewables, has exceeded all of our collective expectations. The IEA, for example, have had to raise their forecasts for renewable energy deployment globally and in China over the course of the last 2 or 3 years, right? So we're seeing this massive growth in renewable energy deployment, a lot of it driven by the economics of renewable energy. Renewable energy is considerably cheaper now, but a lot of it driven by so we're seeing movement. The problem is it's not happening fast enough, and it's not happening to a wider and more diverse set of countries. But if we're able to get these signals, right? If we're able to get these signals in place through NDCs, but NDCs that can be nationally determined contributions, national climate plans, but NDCs that can be funded and implemented with the technological support behind them, and use moments like the Climate Ambition Summit and the COP really to bring countries, corporates together. I think that we can see that implementation. We can see this action on the ground. On early warnings, we're already starting to see some of the really great work that has been harvested from this global initiative being translated into results on the ground. This morning, I was in a call with the resident coordinator network around the world. And the resident coordinator from the Maldives told us about how this one initiative, this early warning system initiative of the Secretary General, has already led to an incredible amount of coordination and collaboration within the UN system and outside of the UN system around strengthening the early warnings system in the Maldives. It's extremely complex. It's a small country, multiple islands, but just this one setting this goal and target, by the Secretary General has already led to results. And we're trying to do this with adaptation, right? Adaptation has always been the stepchild, I shouldn't say that, but the neglected half of the global climate equation. And again, we're promoting this model of collaboration and cooperation around the adaptation plans and priorities of the countries themselves, right? So we're working with UNDP, the NDC partnership, and the Green Climate Fund. You three go off, work together, help countries to develop, move a national adaptation plan or your adaptation component in your nationally determined contribution into an investment plan, right? An economy-wide investment plan from which bankable projects can be derived. Because we hear this complaint from the MDBs and donors. Yeah, country X has its national adaptation plan, but that's not anything that I can invest in. It's just a plan that identifies priorities. These countries need support to turn these very general plans into investment plans and a pipeline of bankable or investable projects. And if we can get all of the donors, or as many of them, coalescing and coordinating around the priorities of the Maldives, be it on water, agriculture, or infrastructure, with a financing package, then of course, this can serve to accelerate action on the adaptation front. Thanks.
Thank you for that, Selwin. Article 2.1c of the Paris Agreement it is clear on finance, and that is the need to make finance flows consistent with a pathway towards low green gas emissions and climate-resistant development. And you've touched upon this in the beginning. Of course, the need is considerable. We all know that. And so, and you sort of worked your way into answering this question, but haven't fully covered it. You're striking at the heart of the issue, no pun intended. But how do you see the Climate Ambition Summit providing guidance for accelerating ambition on climate finance by all the financial stakeholders?
Okay. Yeah. I can't overstate it enough. Finance, public and private finance will be absolutely key to the mobilization of public and private finance at scale will be key to solving all of these issues. The reality is that finance is not going to the activities that they need to go to, or to the places that need finance most, right? So we need more finance directed at at clean energy, at renewable energy. We need more finance to flow to the global south, right? And not only finance, but affordable finance. And quite frankly, that is not happening. It is easier for a developing country to mobilize finance for oil and gas exploration than to construct a renewable energy facility. And why? The high cost of capital, right? We know that 80% of the upfront costs, 80% of the cost of a renewable energy generation facility is upfront costs. You know, you build the windmills or install battery storage, and or you purchase the solar panels and you set that up, and the operating costs are close to zero, right? But it requires, 80% of the cost is upfront, so it's very capital intensive. But the cost of capital is high if you are a developing or an emerging economy. You might not be an investment grade economy. How risk is perceived for an African country is not the same as it is for the UK. So if you're in the UK, and I'm picking on some of my colleagues are from Iceland, cost of capital for a renewable energy investment, is around 0 to 4%. If you're Pakistan, it's close to 20%, or Nigeria, 20%, right? So we really need to change the game significantly. Africa only attracts about 2% globally for clean energy investments, yet it has about 60% of the global solar potential, right? So how can we rejig the financial system in a way that incentivizes investments flowing to the countries and to the activities that need it most? And this is where I think the multilateral development banks, well, first of all, we really need policy shifts and changes in the centers of finance, primarily in the OECD countries. And of course, the credit rating agencies need to change their perceptions of how they perceive and really assess risk in these countries, in developing and emerging economies. They don't have, quite frankly, enough individuals focus on these countries. They don't. So sometimes you have these very distorted perceptions and assessment of risk in many of the developing and emerging economies. But equally important, we need the multilateral development banks, which, as I said before, occupy this very privileged position between public and private finance. And they need internally to completely overhaul, as the Secretary General has said, and change their business models to not only focus on their own operations. It's great that you're dispersing annually a few $billions, but how can you shift your business model from primarily being a lender to a mobilizer of public and private finance? It will require, having sat on the board of one of the MDBs, it will require a fundamental shift in the mindset of these institutions, right? Where your role is simply not getting as many national operations across the or through the door on an annual basis, but you're really focused on using your capital, your ordinary capital or concessional capital that you might be able to mobilize much and use it to leverage much higher levels of private finance to tackle some of these issues. Right. So it really requires, a fundamental reset of the global financial system. But the good news is that money is not a problem, right? There's no absence of global liquidity in the system, right? If it was simply, just throwing money at this issue, as we've seen with other crises and with other issues, it would be easily solved, right? Money is not a problem, but it's just not going to the activities or the places fast enough that can help us to turn this around.
Selwin, last question from me, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. The Climate Ambition Summit will take place against a backdrop where there's a growing state of mistrust between the developing and the developed world. And we saw this at the G20 energy ministers meeting only a few days ago, where the ministers were unable to come to an agreement on fossil fuel phase out. And it will certainly be a challenge for both the Climate Solidarity Pact and COP28. And could you perhaps give us some thoughts on this mistrust that seemingly exists?
Yeah, so, it's really worrying, this mistrust between developed and developing countries. But I think it really needs to be addressed frontally, right? And at the core of this mistrust between developed and developing countries is the fact that promises made have not been promises kept, right? Promises made have not been promises kept, right? In 2009 in Copenhagen, the developed countries committed to mobilize $100 billion a year in climate finance. It's 15 years later, it still hasn't been done. Still has not been done. They've still not been able to mobilize 100 billion, both public and private finance, in the context of meaningful mitigation. It had so many caveats. You can drive a truck through it, but they've still not been able to do it, and that is a problem. It's a fundamental issue of trust and broken promises. So promises kept must be promises. So promises made must be promises kept. And I think, yes, 100 billion is just a drop in the bucket. It's no, but it was a promise. And if you are not able to deliver on that one promise, that small promise, then how can I trust you to deliver on the bigger picture? How can I trust you to think? So delivering on these promises on finance, on the 100 billion, on the doubling of adaptation finance, that was one of the really good outcomes from COP 26. It's absolutely crucial, delivering on operationalizing and designing this loss and damage fund that was agreed on last year. It's absolutely crucial that these promises made are actually kept and delivered. And I think the other area of mistrust is the backtracking and backsliding. So there's this notion of the disagreement at the G20 on phasing out fossil fuel. Yes, we all know that we need to phase out fossil fuels, but if you're advocating for phasing out fossil fuels and simultaneously issuing new oil and gas licensing, you know, that's hypocrisy, right? So, you know, when the IEA says that new oil and gas licensing is incompatible with net zero, so you have many countries, you know, very distrustful of many of these efforts that we're seeing. So I think it's a combination. The source of this distrust really is what we need to address. Promises need to be kept, and countries need to be held by the same standard. You can't ask me to do one thing and then domestically you are doing something else, right? So you know, hopefully the Climate Ambition Summit will address this, but it is in the hands of the developed countries and the developing countries really to repair this broken trust, because finger pointing and blaming will not help us to solve the climate crisis. These countries need to work together, especially the countries in the G20, right? But it must be done with solidarity, and it must be done in a manner that really where countries have confidence that if a country says it will do something, it will actually deliver on it.
Yes, thank you so much for those comments and those insights. So, and we'll now open up the floor to the audience. I know right off the bat, and please forgive me before I turn to you, we have the UAE presidency, COP28 presidency with us somewhere. Please, Chris, if you could take the floor.
Thank you so much, President Zeid and SRSG Hart, for an excellent discussion today. Like many people, the COP28 presidency is keenly interested in the Climate Ambition Summit. Allow me just to offer a few comments on synergies between the two processes. First, we're highly appreciative of the close collaboration with the Secretary General's Climate Action Team. The Climate Ambition Summit is really a crucial point in the finish line to COP28, and equally so, the SG's climate acceleration agenda also provides the opportunity for early political signaling of ambition for COP28. Most people in this room may already be aware of this, but 2 weeks ago, the president of COP28, Dr. Sultan Al-Jaber, shared the COP28 agenda through a letter to state parties of the UN FCCC and stakeholders, and this letter is also available on the COP28 website. The agenda addresses mitigation, adaptation, as well as finance and means of implementation, but it also reflects, importantly, the high demand for placing political attention on topics that were not traditionally in the climate agenda, such as health, peace, food, and biodiversity. One more thing I'd like to mention today, the UAE and COP28 presidency are planning to organize ministerial meetings on loss and damage, as well as the global stocktake on the margins of High Level Week and, of course, of the Climate Ambition Summit. We know there's significant interest in these events, and we're going to be sharing information as soon as possible. Thanks very much, and look forward to continued collaboration at COP.
Thank you very much, Chris. So can I suggest that we take questions in triples, since we're working with 3 pillars for the summit? And so if I can take 2 questions, and then we go back to Selwin and then go back to the audience. So please, if we start from my right, and then we go to the left, and then we go into the centers. Please.
My name is Shazia Rafi. I'm president of Air Quality Asia, former Secretary General of Parliamentarians for Global Action. You've laid out a very clear picture of the SG's ambitions here. One pillar to me seems something that is missing, which is the or else, or how can we get legal compliance in the international system on commitments made for the Paris Treaty. It is, after all, a treaty. It is binding on countries where parliaments ratified it. But more importantly, it's also not just countries that have to comply, it's also corporations. If we look since 1965 at the top 20 corporations that have produced close to 500 billion tons of CO2, there are 12 that are state-owned, 8 that are investor-owned. Every region is represented in them, including the P5. So there is something that needs to link the national legal systems where financial damages can be put on corporations with this international treaty. And this is a question to both of you.
Thank you, Shazia. Please.
I'm Roma Stibbledy, president of NGO Sustainability, and have worked within the United Nations and been part of the diplomatic corps.
And could you hold the microphone close to you so that our online, yeah. If it's on when it's red, yes, and just hold it close to your.
It was on.
Yes,
okay, maybe it wasn't close enough. Okay. I just want to, I had to answer on the financing for renewable energy. And that is, there are many companies, they're rather small, most of them, where you do not need any upfront costs. They provide everything, create everything, get the land, get the materials, and then you just rent like a monthly bill that you get. So think of that as one of the solutions. Now, through my work, I will say that the ones who are doing the most in terms of realizing our goals in the climate change sphere are the high school students, the youth, and they're going to have to live with this the longest. And they do extraordinary things, and one should really capitalize on what youth is doing. One also should think about geoengineering, which you didn't mention. And this is something that we have not included in the agenda, and it could be very helpful in meeting some of the climate change issues. And the last thing I want to say is, obviously, the US has no power to do anything about discouraging China from building coal power plants. So it is up to the developing world. You all owe China money for all kinds of their gold, their Silk Route, and just go on strike and say, if you don't stop building coal plants and build solar energy plants instead, or solar energy or renewable energy instead, you know, you have as much power as the developing world. Take advantage of it.
Thank you. So shall we answer the questions? I'm happy to answer Shazia's question, if you don't mind. Yeah. Well, of course, there are, I think, over 2,000 cases now in various courts around the world, centered mainly Australia, Europe, and the US. And the foremost of them is the Milieu Defensie versus Royal Dutch Shell case, which is now pending before the appellate body in the Netherlands. And if the appellate body next year upholds the decision of the lowest court, of the lower court, it would be massive. I mean, massive implication for the fossil fuel industry. And so I think the point you're raising is already being addressed by legal teams. It is a legal obligation, and the courts will be adjudicating. Can more be done? I think clearly, if you look at the other systems we have in place, human rights and others, one can glean further lessons from that. I think one needs to be as creative as possible in that aspect. So thank you for it. We've worked for many years together, so I'm pleased you raised the question. Thank you, Shazia. Selwin, the other points?
Yeah, I think this point around regulations at the national level is absolutely critical. And one of the key recommendations coming from that report that I mentioned on net zero commitments was if we're going to be truly effective in terms of changing the behavior of corporations and financial institutions, we need to move from voluntary net zero target setting with requiring voluntary transition plans to mandatory, right? And some countries are moving towards that. The UK, for example, is moving towards requiring financial institutions will need to provide transition plans, detailed transition plans. I hope it doesn't get weakened, but we really need to move from voluntary net zero targets and voluntary transition plans to requiring financial institutions, especially to disclose what is your climate risk, physical and transition risk, and how do you intend to transition to net zero? What are your interim targets? Are they science-based? Do they cover scopes 1 and 2 and 3 of your emissions? And you're not using offsets, right, to greenwash, right? Question on or comment on youth, of course. Engaging young people will be is absolutely critical. And the Secretary General has established a youth advisory group, 7 young people from all over the world, and my colleague Esther here from the Climate Action Team, she works directly with the Youth Advisory Group, and they challenge us every single day to push the needle, and it's absolutely fantastic. And in the Climate Ambition Summit, we definitely intend to integrate the concerns, views, perspectives, and of course, the presence of young people. In fact, before the end of this day, we're going to bring together all of the relevant UN system entities to advise us on how best to reflect and engage young people in the lead up to and at the summit itself. And to take on Chris's comments, we're working very closely with the incoming COP presidency. The vision that he released in Brussels at the Ministerial on Climate Action is definitely a step in the right direction. And we see the Climate Ambition Summit really, as Chris said, as really an essential part in the road to COP 28. And COP 28, I didn't mention this, it is a consequential COP in many ways. It's a COP where we're, as I said, where the window of opportunity to limit warming to 1.5 is closing. But in the implementation of the Paris Agreement, and this goes back to it is a moment for the global, what is called the global stocktake. And the global stocktake was an essential, or is an essential component of the Paris Agreement. It is a moment in the implementation of the Paris Agreement. It happens every 5 years. And it is that moment in the Paris Agreement where the parties to the Paris Agreement reflect on where they are in meeting the goals of the Paris Agreement, where they are in terms of meeting the finance goal, the temperature goal, and the adaptation goal of the Paris Agreement. So that backward look, but also with a forward leaning set of recommendations on what needs to be done to get on track, right? And we see many of the political deliverables here, as Chris said, as helping to deliver options and recommendations that can inform the outcome of the global stocktake.
Thank you so much. Yes, sir, at the back, please.
Thank you, Richard Jordan from the Royal Academy of Science International Trust. To follow up on your comment about the UN entities meeting this afternoon, the UN System Staff College, Global Compact, World Bank, FAO, UNITAR, all have digital courses, certificate courses available on climate change, the climate emergency. Do you know if there is one specific unified inventory of online digital courses that are open to everyone, not just UN system personnel? Thank you very much.
Can we take two more questions? Yes, sir, please.
Thank you so much. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I'm with the Russian mission. And my question, well, first of all, I would like to thank for the informative briefing. Now the idea of the Secretary General around the climate ambition sound is much more clearer for us. And our question is much more procedural and technical. So if possible, could you please elaborate on the technicalities? How will the program of the summit look like? How will these three pillars be integrated into this program? Will it be 3 different sessions or will it be 1 plenary session? So it is really essential for us to understand this, to report it to our capitals correctly. But thank you for circulating the invitation yesterday. We have duly processed it to our capital and we are looking forward for the summit. Thank you.
Thank you. And one more question. We have an online question from, and Jimena will read it out.
So we've had a number of questions in the online. So one of them is, and I think it touches upon the youth and future generations. So the person is asking if it would be of strategic value to urge governments to support and respect the rights of future generations as an effective tool to leverage the summit's goals. And can I add my own question?
Yes.
Can I add one more, which is, how can all of us help your office and you to have a successful ambitious summit? How can all of us help you in achieve this? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Over to you, Selwin.
Thanks. To answer the question at the back, I don't know, but I will endeavor, Esther. We will try to figure out the answer to this question. And the second question was on procedure. From a colleague from the Russian Federation. We are going to do a more detailed member state briefing next week, and please, we're an open door. You can come and see us on the program. Still undecided, of course, but we are consulting, and we will be consulting with all member states. As I said, we are doing a member state briefing next week, Thursday, I believe, and if you have any views on how the summit day should look like, it would be welcome. Our focus is on landing the political deliverables in this slide. Slide isn't there, but landing the political deliverables. How we package that on summit day is something that is still not being decided. But in terms of the summit, the SG really wants it to be a meeting for as a state and government. So in terms of participation, he really wants leaders to be present and bring to the table everything that was outlined in the letter of invitation. Agree with you. Insisting on the rights of future generations is obviously something that the SG holds dear to, but unfortunately, our leaders really are not. It's a principle that many of the leaders are really not upholding. And this is leaders from governments and from the private sector, right? So the private sector, they are more focused on the next earnings call, their share prices, these very short-term goals. Many leaders are focused on the next election, what might might help to mobilize various constituencies. So you're seeing lots of pushback. Climate action is now being weaponized in many democracies in terms of being seen as something that's being imposed on people. So protecting the rights of future generations right now is not being reflected in many of the policy choices and decisions that are being made and taken. And how can you help? Okay, should I read my long list? First, no. Wherever you are, we need leaders to show up, right? We need leaders to show up. So put as much pressure on all of your leaders to accept the invitation of the Secretary General and to show up with concrete and ambitious goals, targets, and announcements. To show up and show us how they intend to accelerate during this critical decade on finance, mitigation, adaptation, etc. Right? We need them to show up. Leaders, this is a moment for leaders to show up and be heard. Right? Show up and be heard. We also need really we also need your help in identifying really credible actors on finance, cities, regions with transition plans, credible transition plans who are doing the right thing, right? Far too often, we hear about the actors who are greenwashing and seeking to trick and manipulate the system. We need those good actors, those first movers on the credibility front to be given some spotlight. And finally, on the implementation, encourage countries and corporates and financial institutions really to end this fragmentation, this plethora of initiatives, and really coalesce around really the most ambitious goals and targets to accelerate decarbonization and deliver climate justice. And we need your support in conveying this message on the need for acceleration and cooperation. And you heard from one of the comments, it's blame game, but we need countries to work together in a cooperative spirit to ensure that we can address the challenge of the climate crisis.
Selwin, we could have continued for another half an hour to an hour easily. We've reached our allotted time. At 2:30, we're supposed to end this. We thank you for this initial parlay because we want to book you for another meeting after the summit is over to then have your diagnosis of the outcome and where we go. We're truly grateful for having you spend some of your valuable time with us and sharing your views and the views of the Secretary General in the lead up to the climate summit. And may I ask all of you to put your hands together for our distinguished guest. Thank you.
My friend, no problem. Thank you. And I also want to thank you for the important work, as I said at the beginning, that you and your colleagues at the IPI are doing. It's important that on these global issues, on these global threats and challenges, that we deepen the understanding of everyone involved, so that the actions that are absolutely needed can be taken and taken within the time frame that we need in order to solve them. And your work and the work of your colleagues and all of the folks here is absolutely critical. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for attending. Thank you.